Okay, let's finish up our Battle for Influence in the Middle East 21st Century Showdown with the last team, which is kind of a catch-all team. This is kind of a bizarre category. I'm just going to call it Team 5. And it's kind of a catch-all because it has non-regional players, that is folks from outside the Middle East who are in this game as well as people from the Middle East but who are not states, that is non-state players. And what I mean by this is non-regional, meaning the United States has a heavy hand in what's going on in the Middle East. Okay, but they're not even from the region. And then you have non-state players like, I don't know, Al-Qaeda or Hezbollah, who have major impact on what's going on in this region too, but they're not states. They're groups of people within states. And going back to the non-regional thing, I've taught this way for years, that I use conflict as one of the homogeneous traits that I apply to the whole region of the Middle East. And I've had, for years, people from the Middle East come up to me and say, hey, Boyer, that's really unfair, because doesn't every region have a conflict or two in it? I mean, actually, don't all regions have a bunch of conflict in it? And I say, yeah, that's true. I mean, there are conflicts in East Asia, and conflicts in South America, and certainly conflicts in Central America. But I don't define the whole region as one of the main things we think about that applies across the region. A homogeneous trait is conflict. I don't really say that about any place else on planet Earth except for the Middle East. Well, actually, Central America might fit in there too. But for the Middle East, it really does. And it's because there are conflicts between states, friction and conflict between states, between groups of people who are non-states, like Hezbollah or Hamas. But even more than that, there are people from other parts of the planet involved in the conflicts in the Middle East. The Middle East truly is a global affair because, like, everybody's there. And that is what you cannot say about any of the other regions on planet Earth. Let me rack my brain real quick, but I'm hard-pressed to think of any other region that has power players from across the globe involved in conflicts in the region, as well as all of the conflicts that are already happening within the region of the players within the region too. So that's why I say, yeah, well, this is kind of the thing that happens in the Middle East and what they're kind of known for, and they are in the world's eye because of conflict. Yeah, we pay attention to them because they got old too, but it's really the conflict that, just think about the United Nations and the Palestinian move to get recognition. It's a global thing. The whole world is lining up on either side to decide about some little piece of land in the Middle East. And it's a little piece of land too, friends. But the whole world's in debate about this, and the whole world's on two teams that are pissed about this. And it's happening in the Middle East. It's not happening in their region. It's happening in the Middle East. And you have the United States that has 50, 100,000 troops that are not in their country. They're in the Middle East. And you have entities like Russia and China, which are players in this as well, who are saying, hey, no, we're going to try to stop things from going on in the Middle East. That's why, to back it up for the last time, that's why we need to look at some of these other entities who are struggling for influence within the Middle East too, who aren't even states in the Middle East. Huh? Okay, let's do it. I actually will try to get through this quickly. I'll fail again miserably, I'm sure, since this lecture is like 17 hours long now. But we're looking at mostly the United States, obviously, in terms of non-regional players. The United States, the Europeans, Russia, China. Those are kind of the main exterior ones. You could say the UN, but the UN actually doesn't do squat in this region. Go figure. You got NATO in Libya, but they're already pulling out. But those are kind of the biggies in terms of non-regional. In terms of non-state players, that is people from the region who play a big role and affect change and want things to go their way too. Again, that's where I'm getting to more terrorist slash rebel slash political groups. Things like Al-Qaeda, although they don't play that big of a role. But back to an entity like Hezbollah. It's not a state. I mean, it's not a government. It's an entity that does affect what's happening in this region. So let's look at some of these kind of one by one. how do we get the U.S. and the Europeans and all these other people involved in this region? Because again, I'm going to say it again, because you can't go to any other region on planet Earth and see all of these international entities putting their fingers in this pot. You don't have the Russians and Chinese and Europeans and Americans all, foaming at the mouth, debating about something in South America. They do about the Middle East. So how did it get to be this way? Well, you already know from our huge kind of over-involvement talking about history, sorry about that the Europeans, of course, came in and took over this place after the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I. They had their mandate system where they were in pretty much utter control, although they called them mandates. They were something closer to a colony. And that's something that I've already referred to that still leaves a bad taste in many Middle Easterners' mouths about their attitudes towards the Europeans. Again, it kind of plays through to today's world. I'm not saying it's open hostility, but it's there. There's no great love between most Middle Eastern states and the Europeans, at least the peoples of Middle Eastern states. And that kind of translated into, after all the Europeans finally did pull out after World War II and all these places became independent, then of course you have immediate launching into the Cold War. And that's where you had the United States, shoring up its strategic ties with places like Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, and eventually Egypt. Remember from Charlie Wilson's war? Egypt went back and forth. Egypt originally was going to side up with the commies and kind of did, but then they kind of got pulled back into the United States camp. And of course you have Israel, who's always been a staunch ally both of the Europeans, but mostly the United States, the U.S. and U.K. for sure. Europe in general, as a whole, you can say, has been a strong Israeli ally. And then you have the Russians who are in there, again, trying to tease off and get other folks in the Middle East to side up with them. And they had the most success with, surprise, surprise, Iran, who after the revolution, which threw out the Iranian Shah, who was supported by the U.S., which everybody in Iran knew about. That's why they hated the U.S. I won't say fell in league with the commies, but certainly became more of a buddy of the commies than they were Team West. So you have that, again, outside entities affecting what's happening in this Middle Eastern arena of politics and unfolding current historical, now current events. That's no surprise. Again, the Cold War affected all parts of planet Earth, but I want to make sure you understand how these outside entities got to where they are in today's 21st century. And now you fold out, the Cold War's over, so nobody cares about commies versus the capitalist. However, old relations die hard, and so you still have Russia, which has a working relationship with Iran, while everybody else hates their guts. Hates the Iranians' guts, not the Russians. But the Cold War's gone, and so now we're folding into the War on Terror years, and that's been since. No sooner did you get the Cold War finished and wrapped up, and yay, we can all celebrate. There's not going to be a global thermonuclear war between the Russians and the U.S. That the United States starts the War on Terror. Again, not making fun of the United States. September 11th attacks kind of launched this. And that's where you had folks saying, oh, golly, here you go. We got to go into not the Middle East per se, but Afghanistan to get those folks, those terrorists up there. And then it was just a hop, skip, and a jump before we got back to the Middle East because the United States deemed it necessary to go get that Saddam Hussein, that damn Saddam, there in Iraq. Our former Arab shield, if you remember from a couple of hours ago back in this lecture, that then turned on Kuwait and had to get his pee-pee smacked for doing that. And then after the first Gulf War, the United States left, and 2001 comes back. Now we got the War on Terror, and we have to go back because Saddam's got weapons of mass destruction. Again, this is a story that's starting to sound familiar because maybe now that's what we're saying about Iran, but don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. So the War on Terror now reintroduces the United States and all of its military might back into the region in an even bigger way. The first Gulf War, when the U.S. went in to kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, that had international backing. The United Nations backed that. The Arab countries backed that. Everybody backed that. I bet Iran probably even backed that. Because Saddam was crazy and everybody knew he was crazy. And Iran hated it, Saddam Hussein, so they might have even backed it. So while it was an international coalition that wasn't too offensive to anybody in the Middle East, except Saddam and his boys, it still pulled in tens of thousands of, maybe 100,000 U.S. troops and battleships, which then became U.S. bases, and that's where you got United States soldiers stationed kind of semi-permanently on Saudi Arabian soil. And why would I suggest that's important, that particular fact? Because that's what Osama bin Laden and his crew were pissed off about, because they're saying, hey, there shouldn't be foreigners here. And we didn't like Saddam Hussein either, but there shouldn't be foreigners. There shouldn't be the U.S. capitalist pigs on holy ground, on Saudi Arabian soil. And so now we're going to start Al-Qaeda. Hey, now we've gotten to a regional non-state player, an entity like Al-Qaeda, and other groups like them that start to have animosity and friction towards the foreign powers that are there intervening, which of course have been there for forever perhaps, but now in your face, because there's people in combat boots with guns and missiles and tanks and stuff there on your soil. And that was the first Gulf War that everybody kind of thought was okay. Then that goes away, and now you have the second Gulf War because, hey, there's terrorists in Afghanistan, which means Saddam Hussein must have weapons. Sorry, a synapse forgot to fire on that one, as it did for the United States. So the U.S. had to go back into Iraq with more troops, more people, more bases, more missiles, more everything. Starting to see it add up, all right? Outside influence of the United States obviously is one of the heaviest exterior players here to fight the war on terror that started in Afghanistan and put a bunch of troops on the far side of Iran, and then got into Iraq, which put a bunch of troops on the other side of Iran. And it's appearing that we're going to stay there. I say we, the United States is going to at least maintain a presence in the neighborhood, even though they're pulling out of Iraq, because, of course, everybody is now worried about the next war, which is going to be against Iran. Sorry. I call them like I see them, not how you want it to be. And that is something that people are not paying attention to too much in the United States. And I want you to be smarter, is that even in the last year of the Bush administration, they said, hey, we're going to start pulling troops out of Iraq. And then when the Obama administration took over, they said, yes, Iraq's fine, which they're not, but Iraq's fine, and we're going to pull troops out of Iraq. Don't think for a second that that equates to the United States pulling everything out of this region, because they're not. They're not. Kuwait, I think, has just agreed to have a bigger number of U.S. troops stationed there than ever before. I'm pretty sure there's still U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. I'm positive that the U.S. naval base in Bahrain ain't going nowhere and probably getting bigger. So the U.S. presence, while diminishing in Iraq, is certainly not diminishing in the region. And for all of the reasons that you probably are guessing, a lot of people are like, oh, it's because of oil, we got to protect the oil. You know what? I'll give you that. Maybe it's partly to make sure that nothing happens in the Persian Gulf, to try to minimize any threat of war from Iran or between other entities, to keep the oil flowing. But it's also because our Arab allies, that is the U.S. Arab allies, probably don't want the United States to leave in any great hurry. They're not keen on the growing power of Iran. Israel certainly does not want to see the U.S. pull all of its troops and firepower out of this region. They would be very worried about that. Turkey actually has some United States air bases there. Turkey's a NATO member. Turkey may not be keen on the U.S. increasing troop presence, but Turkey's not going to have a gigantic problem with U.S. presence. They're a NATO member, for goodness sake. Of course there's going to be U.S. troops there. So what I'm trying to suggest is you have, from the colonial era to the Cold War era to now the war on terrorism era, you do have this profound outside influence into this particular region that is very unique, because you simply do not have that much outside interference in any other world region we're going to talk about. It just doesn't exist. Now, back to what is the couple other world players who are playing around and want to influence what happens in the Middle East. And that's Russia and China. And I can get through this quickly because I'm pretty sure I referenced this in an earlier lecture as well. The Russians have a a relationship with Iran that they have since the Cold War. The Chinese as well. And the Chinese are mostly interested in oil. Surprise, surprise. I don't even think that they would even, cut much corners saying that out loud. The Chinese buy a lot of Iranian oil. They don't want the oil taps cut off. They don't want a conflict here, and they don't want Iran to have an embargo against them because they do business with Iran. So does Russia. But actually, it's kind of the reverse. There are Russian businesses there making money off the Iranian government. The Russians are the ones who help build the nuclear energy industry in Iran. Usually it's Russian technology and Russian plans and Russian know-how that helps countries around the world, but specifically in Iran, build like nuclear power plants and reactors and stuff. So these two major entities, which have veto power, of course, at the Permanent Security Council, have their own vested interest in making sure that Iran is not completely isolated, that Iran is open for business, and they are the countries that have continually made sure that the United Nations as a whole can't do much to Iran. Now, having said that, Russia and China, they don't block everything. It's not like they veto everything that has anything to do with Iran. They're kind of leery of Iran, too. I mean, who wouldn't be? But they do business there. And so what they have, they've stymied stuff. They've not really stopped stuff. So the United States and the Europeans for decades have said, we want to have a full-on embargo against Iran. They're evil. They're part of the axis of evil. They want a nuclear weapon. We need to do all these things to stop Iran. Nobody should buy from Iran. Nobody should sell to Iran. And by and large, the U.S. hasn't. And most European countries don't either. But Russia and China for years have said, oh, we don't think so. So when the United States and the Europeans go to the United Nations and say, hey, we want a worldwide embargo against Iran, it's the Russians and Chinese which usually get in the way of that. And they're like, no, we don't think so. Now, you can smack them on the wrist if you like. You can have an embargo against certain select items which we don't want, but you're not going to have some full-scale embargo. That is the Chinese and Russian influence here. And let me restate again, though, I think even the Russians and Chinese sometimes lose patience with Iran. They're like, yeah, we do business here, and business comes first, but boy, these guys look like troublemakers. Do the Chinese or the Russians really want to be the reason that suddenly Iran pops up with a nuclear weapon tomorrow? Because it's not in Russia or China's vested interest for Iran to have a nuclear weapon either. It's in no one's vested interest except Iran for them to get a nuclear weapon. So that's the kind of politics. And I'm not even talking about all the countries in the world. I'm talking about the major players, again, who have a finger in the pie of what's happening in the Middle East. Now, let's switch to wrap up the non-state actors. The non-state actors that are actually groups within the Middle East who also play a major role in what goes down. Namely, and I'm going to pick the easy ones first, like Al-Qaeda. You obviously, unless you've been living under a rock in Bora Bora for the last 20 years, you've heard of the Al-Qaeda. Them Al-Qaeders that are mostly known for being in Pakistan and Iraq, and of course Osama bin Laden just got killed in Pakistan. It's a worldwide movement now, but its roots were in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. That's where bin Laden and his crew were from for reasons which I've already cited. And there are folks like that. Again, Al-Qaeda is kind of like a franchise now, like a McDonald's. And they have their own little stores all over planet Earth that they may talk to the mother store, but they're kind of on their own. They're a franchise. And you do have those entities within the Middle East. I won't say all countries, but certainly in a country like Yemen, there is a very pronounced Al-Qaeda group down there. They're like, hey, here we are, and we're trying to take over Yemen, by the way. And the bombing of the USS Cole happened in Yemen, probably by Al-Qaeda operatives. So Al-Qaeda is still a significant player in all of this as well. In fact, perhaps an increasing player in the Arabian Peninsula, not so much in Afghanistan anymore. And, there are Al-Qaeda elements, and they've cropped up in Algeria before, and lots of different places around the Arab world. Not huge, okay, but they're still players, particularly in Yemen. And the other three that I really or other two, stick it to two, that I really kind of do want you to know by name and by sight, are Hezbollah, which we've referenced many times. That's a political / rebel / terrorist group located in southern Lebanon that I have to put all of those precursors in front of, because it depends on not only who you ask but where you are as to what Hezbollah is. it is a group that has as one of its goals the destruction of Israel. That's what makes it problematic for Israel and the United States and the Europeans, all of who count Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. But they're also a political group, like the Republicans or the Democrats, and they have a political faction who runs for office in Lebanon, and in fact, I believe they hold the lion's share of political power in Lebanon at this point. So it's a tricky entity to try to define to Westerners, because in our world, it's like you have political parties and terrorists, and they're never anywhere close to each other. Well, that ain't true everywhere on planet Earth, and it's not true here, because Hezbollah is kind of both. They run for office and want to, have policies and do stuff, but then they have this overlapping militant wing that also wants to go destroy Israel and do lots of other perhaps nasty things. So Hezbollah, you now know, I hope, is funded almost openly at this point by Iran, although the Iranians still completely deny, but it's like a 30-year documented thing that, everybody knows this is happening, that money and guns from Iran flow through Syria and get to Hezbollah in Lebanon for them to increase their power and affect actions, and they do. Hezbollah kind of won a war against Israel a couple of years ago that you'll hear reference to. And by winning, they won because they survived. They often throw rocket attacks or do terrorist attacks or abduct Israeli soldiers and pull them from Israel, or throw a bomb into Israel, or grab soldiers and pull them into, as hostages, pull them into southern Lebanon. And this has happened for a long time. So at one point, I think it was just a year and a half or 2 years ago, the Israelis said, okay, that's enough of that. We're going to come invade and bomb Hezbollah positions until they surrender or go away. And after an extended bombing campaign, which hit a bunch of civilian targets, because Hezbollah doesn't have a major base, they're just people within Lebanon. So how do you root them out? Just like the same way it's hard to root out any small group of people anywhere on planet Earth. So after a sustained bombing campaign that got tremendous amounts of negative press for Israel for bombing southern Lebanon, Hezbollah walks out looking like the victor, because they're like, hey, we're still here. We're still here, and we made Israel look bad because they bombed a bunch of civilians. And that is the power that Hezbollah has. And again, they have the power to go attack Israel. They really don't have the real ass to actually go win a war against Israel. It's mostly a political thing that they can pinprick Israel until something happens, and then they can make political hay out of whatever goes down. And that's exactly what happened a couple years ago. They can make Israel look bad by striking back, and so they are a major player. And again, they are kind of cementing their control over Lebanon because they have so much support in Lebanon, I guess. I'm not even going to lie. I really don't understand the Lebanese political situation because it's so convoluted and there's so many parties and so many people involved. But they are a major force within Lebanon. And, they're kind of, again, an arm of Iranian power that most folks outside of the region consider a terrorist group, but not all folks within the region do. Does that make sense? So Hezbollah up there in Lebanon. Okay, and by the way, I guess I should have explained a little bit of this. The reason why Syria has allowed all this to happen for so long is because they used to kind of control Lebanon. The army pretty much outright controlled southern Lebanon, if not all Lebanon, for a long time. They've always looked at Lebanon as kind of like their little brother that they kind of should have, if not ownership over, should influence and control. Again, another kind of internal power struggle within the Middle East. And so when they finally got kicked out not that long ago, or the world was like, dude, you can't have your military here, you can't control Lebanon anymore, Syria, they're a sovereign state, you need to finally get out. They've allowed this to happen again as it's a proxy. You allow other things to happen so things go your way. So Iran wants to destroy Israel, so Iran wants to fund and fuel Hezbollah and get them all rattled up. And Syria, who might not necessarily want to destroy Iran, does not want to destroy Israel, doesn't want to make Israel's life any easier either, because remember, Syria wants the Golan Heights back that Israel possesses. So they have a vested interest in allowing Hezbollah to go and poke at Israel as well. That's why Syria allowed this. That's why Syria became the conduit for the money and guns to get to Hezbollah. And that's, again, why the Syrian leadership has been kind of tight with Iran all these years, and why now the Arab League has just turned their back on for Bashar al-Assad and his regime for doing all that. And that's why I wanted to bring that back up, because Hezbollah is pretty powerful in Lebanon and does make a major impact in Israeli politics and in current events in this particular part of the world. But their times are changing fast too. If the Syrian leadership falls, which seems likely in the next year, then who knows how they'll get their money and guns from Iran in the future. So that all of this is interwoven, and it's going to affect all of these players. And let me get down finally to the last player. Okay, there is two more, but I'm just one major one that causes friction in the area, and that is Hamas. And this is wildly confusing. I intentionally did not talk about this when we told the whole story of Israel and its creation in the modern era, and since 1947, declared independence in 48, and you had the Palestinians and their allies who were fighting back, and there have been multiple wars and all that stuff. I intentionally didn't bring up Hamas or Fatah at that point, because these are two political parties within Palestine. Again, like Republican or Democrats. Fatah, F-A-T-A-H, has been the primary, major, main political party for Palestine for virtually all the last 60 years. They were really the only political party standing up for Palestinian rights and fighting the good fight against Israel, both, must say, militarily, but also politically. And, you know, and their Fatah is the political party to the world that would go to the United Nations and say, hey, we should get in, Palestine should be recognized. In fact, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, is of the Fatah group. And Fatah pretty much now controls the West Bank. Fatah used to control all of Palestine. Like I just said, they kind of were the only political party. However, so where it gets tricky, stay with me, stay with me. Fatah has been the major leader even when they used to not recognize Israel, but morphing over the years to legitimize themselves and try to legitimize their stance of getting Palestinian sovereignty, they eventually did kind of, sort of recognize the right of Israel to exist, which is why they are, Fatah, they are the recognized player that Israel talks to, that the United States talks to, that the United Nations talks to. Okay, you with me so far? So it's a political party, the main political party, which has been in charge of Palestine for most of the last 60 years. Okay, who are the other guys then? The other guys are Hamas, and they are a kind of a splinter group, different political party, who basically got fed up with Fatah and its weakness. Because folks in Palestine, both in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and that's two geographic entities, okay? Everybody used to be Fatah, say, 10 or 20 years ago, but people increasingly started to say, dude, we have this one political party and they ain't done shit forever. We are worse off than we were 60 years ago. Every day that goes by, we're getting worse and worse and worse. Why do we have these guys in charge? We would like to have another voice, and the other voice became known as a political entity named Hamas, H-A-M-A-S. Hamas, again, started as a political movement of people saying, we're anti-Fatah. No. We actually don't want to recognize Israel. We want to be perhaps a little more extreme. We want to be a little more forthright. We want to demand more stuff, and we might even attack Israel if it comes down to that. Fatah has gotten too weak and too soft and too corrupt, and they ain't doing squatto nothing. Vote for us. Again, they started as a political organization, but also as kind of a fringe, hey, we might blow stuff up organization. Kind of like Hezbollah. So, in a big election that happened a few years ago, right, Hamas was starting to gain in popularity, and then they had a Palestinian election. It's kind of like a democracy, but they're not a state, so I don't know what the hell you call it. So they had an election, and lo and behold, Hamas won. And this troubled the hell out of everybody, except the people who voted for Hamas. Because, again, like Hezbollah, Hamas is a political party, but also has kind of a militant wing who might have been and was throwing rockets and blowing up shit in Israel. So the second that Hamas won the election, a democratically held election. The second that they won it, they were going to be in charge of Palestine. And they were going to get to make policy for Palestine, including foreign policy, including military policy, perhaps. As soon as Hamas, it was declared the victor, and they were going to get to choose the next president or the next prime minister. The second that happened, the United States said, we cut off all diplomatic relations with Palestine. We will not recognize Hamas as a leader. They're a terrorist organization. Israel said the same thing. We cut off all funding and all recognition of anybody if you guys put Hamas in charge. Most of the European countries fell in the line too. Most of Team West said, nope, we will not deal with Hamas. That we call them a terrorist organization. They cannot be in charge of Palestine. Got it so far? So Fatah, Hamas. Now it's a political rift that the outside world, once again, we're pulling in outsiders, are looking at this saying, oh, no, this is involving the whole world and this is going to change the equation of the peace process, so we're not going to recognize Hamas or any government that Hamas leads. When this happened, again, this is just a few years ago, go Google it, wiki it. When this happened, the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas, the guy who's still in charge, said, oh, well, dudes, here's the deal. We can't now recognize this election, obviously, because to do so would mean that no one will recognize us ever. We can't deal. So we're pretty much just going to null and void that election. And when that happened, all hell broke loose. The Hamas supporters started fighting the Fatah supporters and vice versa. And basically what you had is a civil war that occurred in a non-state. It's got to be the first time that ever happened. So, the end result of which is that Fatah ended up holding control of the West Bank, the big chunk of Palestine, and Hamas now controls the Gaza Strip. That's kind of where the Hamas movement started from anyway, so it's not surprising. So in the Gaza Strip, it's now Hamas run, and Hamas kicked all the Fatah guys out of there, and up in the West Bank, it's held by Fatah, and they kicked out all the Hamas people. So this is even now further complicated, this whole mess, that you have now these other entities. There's not even a single Palestine to deal with at the table anymore. Again, the outside world largely looks at Hamas as a terrorist organization, so it doesn't recognize it. So when you have heard stories about the Palestinians going to the United Nations to put forward their resolution to get statehood, that's Mahmoud Abbas, that's Fatah, that's the West Bank guy. It's not the Gaza Strip. It's not Hamas. Right this second, there is no unified Palestinian government. It's two groups, of which the outside world only recognizes the West Bank guys. That's Fatah. Whew. Got it? Whew. It is confusing crap, is it not? All right. Well, those are some of the inside players and outside players. And I've got to think, that's probably something else I meant to tell you about the whole Hamas mess. Oh, I will. Yeah, you know what? Let me throw this in too. Israel hates Hamas. They're dealing with Fatah. They've brokered kind of peace with the Fatah folks, but they hate Hamas because Hamas does have this kind of radical fringe terrorist edge on it that does throw rockets and stuff into southern Israel, and that has been going on. Because of that, and because of the whole election and civil war nonsense that happened between Fatah and Hamas, Israel also isolated Gaza Strip, pretty much surrounded it, and has a full-on embargo against it. That is, Israel controls all of the land and sea around Gaza, and a lot of folks in the world have been claiming that essentially Israel is starving the folks out, starving them out until they get rid of the Hamas leadership, that it's causing civilian casualties, that it's almost like a genocide. There are lots of things that the outside world, certain members of the outside world, have been saying about the Israeli blockade of Gaza. The reason I wanted to specifically bring it up is because that's another reason that, once again, all of these entities I'm talking about have made this issue into a global issue. Because it's Israeli embargo against Gaza is the reason that folks started to try to break the Israeli blockade and get food and medicine and building supplies into the Gaza Strip. And in one such instance where some Turkish ships tried to break the Israeli blockade to go help Palestinians in Gaza Strip, an Israeli Navy ship intercepted a Turkish ship and boarded it, and a fist fight broke out, which turned into a gunfight in which some Turkish citizens were killed. And now you know why Turkey and Israel are pissed off at each other. There you go. I knew it would all come around to me eventually. That is why Recep Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, is furious at Israel. He demanded an apology and said Israel was being ridiculous with the blockade and it was just killing civilians, and now they've killed Turkish citizens. That, about a year and a half ago, is what lit the fuse of blowing up the what were otherwise good Israeli-Turkish relationship. Got it? I knew I wanted to talk about something like that. That's why I wanted to talk about Hamas. It's like it's a really small little political/terrorist group in the Gaza Strip, which is about as big as my backyard. But it affects the world. Power players and battling for influence and everything else going down in this region. Every single little thing that happens somehow affects the entire planet, and the whole planet's in this game. Can you believe it? How nonsensical is all this stuff?